Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. It's a time of year when even the most self-denying among us relax a little and give way to appetite and self-indulgence. Perhaps, though, we should be living like that all year round, letting the pursuit of pleasure guide our lives. The original hedonists would have thought so, and hedonism is what we're talking about this morning, with the classicist Kurt Lampe, whose book The Birth of Hedonism details the intellectual origins of the idea that a lot of what you fancy does you good. Also with us, the science writer Zoe Cormier, whose book Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll investigates the science of human pleasure, and Greg Doran, artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, who's just brought that great hero of self-indulgence, Falstaff, to the London stage in his production of Shakespeare's Henry IV plays. And, for reasons of balance, a little bit of ascetic self-denial too, which the sociologist Julia Twigg argues is far more widespread in the modern world than we might think. But we're going to start with Kurt Lampe. Kurt, your book, you've written a book called The Birth of Hedonism about the Cyrenaic school of philosophy, roughly around the turn of the 3rd century. Mm. Most listeners, I think, would know what hedonism means now, which is just a kind of sensual self-indulgence. Some, I guess, would then also associate it with philosophy, but they might come up with the name Epicurus. Mm. You're going further back. You're going back to the origins. What did hedonism mean back in 390 BC?
Okay, well, I think that's a great question to start with, because one of the, at least if you're thinking about it philosophically, one of the important points to begin with when you're talking about hedonism is to say the word means lots of different things, and in fact, it's a modern word. If you look at the most important modern philosophical, most prestigious introductions to hedonism, you'll find statements like hedonism is the belief that all and only pleasure motivates human beings, or hedonism is the belief that all and only pleasure has intrinsic value or importance for human beings. And that is compatible with all sorts of different lifestyles. For example, you can believe that and perhaps be a mathematician, you could be a progressive politician, you could be a barista at a cafe, or many other things. That's not really true of ancient hedonisms like Cyrenaicism or Epicureanism.
So what's the further step they take?
Yes. You don't really get to the essence, I think, of these philosophies, and you lose a lot of what's important about them if you think that the core of them is a belief that pleasure is important or is motivational. Rather, I think it's useful to think of them as entire ways of life. That's why the subtitle to my book involves the phrase "way of life." So hedonism in the ancient, for Cyrenaicism, for example, would be, of course, it would involve those beliefs, but then it would also be a network of ways of thinking and speaking, a network of emotions and aspirations, a network of behaviors and deliberate exercises, perhaps even a network of imagination, patterns of all these things, which are knitted together by the fact that pleasure is sort of a guiding star in all the different domains.
Your central figure is Aristippus. I mean, he is the great mover for this. The school kind of seems to form around him. One of the interesting things, reading your book, is that our knowledge of his philosophy seems to be largely preserved in disapproving accounts of it. That we mostly get it through people who thought he was wrong.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. In the ancient tradition, hedonism was always a minority and always the odd man out. So there was lots and lots of philosophical schools in the ancient world, most of which non-specialists forget about these days, and we don't have much evidence about them. But in later antiquity, you get this tendency to unify all of them, to say, oh, well, they're all kind of saying the same thing. You get this again in the Renaissance, the attempt to...
But the disapproval is very largely about lifestyle, isn't it? There's wonderful title for one of Aristippus's works, Towards Those Who Blame Him for Being Extravagant in His Expenditure on Fish. So he comes along and he says, all right, I'm going to philosophically defend spending a lot of money on fish. How does he go about it?
Well, that work is probably spurious and doesn't survive. How would he go about it? Well, fish. It's important to say that in ancient Greek antiquity, fish is the premier luxury food. So this would be like a defense of eating caviar today, for example. And how would he go about it? Well, we would just imagine that the book will defend basically the goodness of pleasure. There's anecdotes, for example, where he's blamed for spending a lot of money on fish, or some other luxury food, and he says, well, would you spend this amount of money? You spent $1,000 on caviar yesterday. Well, he says, would you have spent $10 if you had on caviar? In any event, the anecdote will end up with the point, well, the problem is not that I spend too much on, that I think too much of pleasure. The problem is that you think too much of money, right? So this is what's valuable, so of course I spend money on it.
This derives from actually quite a kind of serious philosophy of perception, doesn't it? Because they begin from the point that all we can know is our own responses to the world. And so any other value might be illusory or...
Well, I would start by saying I wouldn't agree that it derives from that. So they have a theory of value that we can't really know anything, just to present it very basically.
I mean, we're subject to our senses.
Exactly. But what we can know is that there's an experience which is attractive, let's call it pleasure, and there's another experience which is repulsive, let's call it pain. Well, okay, then why don't we organize our lives around that? But I think that if we say that that is the original perception or belief and that hedonism follows, then we're probably really misrepresenting them. So going back to what I originally said about this whole existential network or system of patterns, I think all of the different beliefs and sets of arguments arise together in the effort to articulate and also justify a way of life which the people who are attracted to this school are predisposed to like.
Are there ways in which we might find ourselves being Cyrenaics without knowing it? I mean, I was very struck by Aristippus on living for the moment, and I thought that's a very contemporary idea, the idea of living for the moment and not giving thought to the past, not being anxious about the past, not being anxious about the future. I mean, it has a very diluted form now, but it's the same thing, isn't it?
Well, I'll address, I think there's 2 points there. The first point, are we Cyrenaics without knowing it? Well, yes, I think a lot of people today are hedonists. I recently participated in a stoicism experiment that begins with a questionnaire, and then you get the results of everyone. Like 2,500 people participated. And it's clear that a lot of people in that questionnaire do believe that pleasure is very important. We're not Cyrenaics in the sense that the Cyrenaics, what makes them philosophers is they attempt to rationalize our lives and to educate themselves in a way that will be most effective for the pursuit of pleasure.
Before I open it up, we have to talk about the question of ethics, because that was the problem for the opponents of the original hedonists, wasn't it? I mean, Socrates wants ethics in there, and it's quite difficult to get ethics in, isn't it? If you start with an entirely solipsistic notion of what is going to provide the most pleasure for me.
Yeah, well, that is very important to say, that the Cyrenaics were not interested in the greatest pleasure of the greatest number of people. They're definitely interested in the greatest pleasure for the agent, for the person who is thinking or enacting.
And did they have a way of getting ethical behaviour, knitting ethical behaviour into that, or did they just say, well, that's an illusion, we won't bother with it?
It's not entirely clear. Broadly defined, they would certainly say that they are interested in the pursuit of human excellence. All ancient philosophers are, and I think that this is often underestimated in scholarship on the Cyrenaics. But when we talk about virtues in ancient philosophy, the word virtue is a very fuddy-duddy word today, and we think of, I don't know, courage and justice and just the main canonical virtues. But for the Cyrenaics, virtue is often, I think, well, it will probably include those things to some extent, although they have some doubts about issues like justice. But it will also include things like gracefulness, wittiness, and so on. And their basic position is that...
So you didn't have to be able to taste it or smell it to know that it was a virtue. You could experience it through a different way.
I'm not...
Well, I'm just saying that if your notion of pleasure is what gives you pleasure through your senses...
Sure.
You can't taste or smell
yes.
the sense of doing the right thing, and yet it still can give you pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. You could take attitudinal pleasure in the fact in perceiving your own virtue. I think that becomes important in one of the later moments in the school. And also the basic position is that in order to live a pleasant life, you will realize you have to educate yourself and develop all these virtues.
They suffer in many ways, don't they, from a kind of anxiety about pleasure, which seems to have been present throughout human history. I mean, Zoe Cormier, there's an interesting line in your book. It is in the animalistic part of ourselves that we discover some of the most startling ideas about what it is to be human. But that's slightly counterintuitive, because most philosophies fear the animalistic part of ourselves and find ways to suppress them, don't they?
Yes. There's one word that comes up quite a lot in Henry IV as well that we're going to talk about, which is the word base. And these animalistic part of ourselves tend to be denigrated, and we tend to fear them, and we tend to debase them, and we feel guilty about them, which is a shame, because the more you look at it through a scientific lens, the more you realize that these parts of our character really have a lot of redemptive value, and there is virtue in having fun. It's quite funny. My mother, when she read my book, she summed up 3 years of research in one sentence. Most fun things in life are bad for you, but nothing kills you faster than no fun at all.
That's a good one for Christmas. Yeah, good lineup for Christmas. Did the Greeks have that same notion of baseness, of an animal existence that lay beneath rational existence?
Yeah, absolutely. And many of the Cyrenaics opponents thought that that hedonism was, for example, the life of a mollusk or the life of a gnat.
Socrates says this, doesn't he? Yeah, unless you think you're
Plato puts this in the mouth of Socrates. Let's put it that way instead.
Greg Doran, I checked. Hedonism occurs nowhere in Shakespeare, but the word pleasure hundreds of times. I mean, 192 times if you check the concordance.
Yes, this is true. I mean, he does refer to Epicureanism on a couple of occasions, but I'm very grateful to Kurt for giving me another adjective to describe Falstaff. He's Cyrenaic in many ways. He's probably not, in fact, but no, that's right. It's a wonderful study, Falstaff. Well, I suppose. Is it hedonism? I mean, he's certainly a kind of great metaphor for appetite and pleasure. But I suppose there's also a spectrum in the plays, because he is on one side of Prince Hal, and on the other side of Prince Hal is the king, who is dangerous, thinks that there is a dangerous influence in Falstaff, and he would prefer a bit more restraint.
Yeah, well, he's very definitely coming from your side, isn't he, Julia Twigg, in arguing for asceticism and arguing for the importance of holding back. I'm not electing you as a spokesman for asceticism, because you looked stricken and appalled at that thought.
Yes, absolutely right. No, I sort of think of Falstaff as a Rabelaisian figure, sort of enjoying all aspects of the body, of which drink and food are only some, as it were. But I suppose, I was interested in your production. You show Falstaff not quite as nice as that makes it sound. There's cruelty there. There's certainly selfishness and self-absorption and instrumentality. And I suppose I'd put back to Kurt the question of intersubjectivity in relation to pleasure. I mean, many of the greatest pleasures people have are in their relationships, in their human relationships, and not necessarily simply in sexual relations, so obviously that's very significant. But a lot of our feeling of well-being, joy, pleasure in the world comes from our sense of belonging within a society of other people.
Yeah, there's an interesting debate in Cyrenaicism about this that really rages. On the one hand, you have a strong tendency towards solipsism, as was mentioned earlier, which is to say a tendency to be very cool, to deny the importance of intimate personal relationships. Hence, within the domain of sex, most of the anecdotes focus on the time they spend with courtesans and prostitutes. And even at the furthest extreme, you get the denial of the existence of friendship, the existence of gratitude, the possibility of doing a genuine good deed, and so on. Then you get also a movement within, or a sect within the movement, that objects to this and says, no, actually, friendship is absolutely essential to hedonism. And that's going to be actually the same line that the Epicureans take. Epicurean hedonism, really one of the most important bedrocks of Epicurean hedonism is friendship. Epicurus says friendship goes dancing around the world and announcing to everyone.
Falstaff is very big on friendship himself, but in an instrumental way, isn't he? I mean, that's the cruel thing that you...
well, also there's... I think it's Harold Bloom describes Falstaff as the Eastcheap Socrates, and in a way he is, in terms of, I suppose, Socrates' relationship as a corrupter of youth, if you like, of Alcibiades, for instance, and Socrates' relationship to Alcibiades, as it is mentioned in Plato's Symposium, at any rate, I guess is he's erotically attracted to Alcibiades, and yet Alcibiades cannot get him to do anything about it. I don't think Falstaff is erotically attracted. At least that's not not that I've noticed, to Prince Hal, but that relationship is a crucial relationship. And I think you're right. I think Falstaff is selfish. He's egocentric, and I think he sums it up in a way when he describes this little kingdom man. It's as if he has an extraordinary speech about alcohol, which always surprises me because it rises to a climax as he describes the virtues of sherry sack, and which give him courage and make him valorous. But it concludes with this extraordinary line where he says, if I had 1,000 sons, the first principle I should teach them would be to addict themselves to sack. And the audience often respond with applause at that point, which is a huge surprise to me that he should have it's a very subversive attraction.
It is, but I was struck actually because I'd been reading your book, Kurt, that when you get to that great speech on honour, I mean, you describing it is a Socratic speech. It says, what is in that word honour? What is that word honour? Air, a trim reckoning. Who hath it? He who died. It's a sort of Socratic method of working through an argument. So he's much more of a philosopher of pleasure than we casually take him for.
He's a great philosopher, and I think he's also dangerous in that philosophy, because I think that's, there are if he was just a drunk old man, then there would be no danger in Falstaff. But the fact is that that he is he's a corrupter of not just any old youth but the Prince of Wales, and in a context in which the world is at war, at a war footing. So his lack of restraint is regarded by society, if you like, as intolerable.
Also, nobody worries about a corrupter whose arguments aren't very good, but his arguments are rather tempting. I mean, he describes learning as a mere hoard of gold kept by a devil till sack commences it and sets it in act and use. So he says alcohol's very good for you. It sort of frees things. I mean, the disinhibition which you talk about, Zoe Cormier.
Yes.
He says, great, go for it.
Yes. I mean, well, first of all, I just want to add, you talked about Falstaff being dangerous. Aren't most good philosophers dangerous?
There you go.
Is he a good philosopher, though? That is why the play works, isn't it?
He's very seductive in that philosophy, isn't he?
Yeah.
We love him.
One thing that's wonderful about Falstaff that you note is how loved he is by audiences, and that's sort of what he is a mirror showing us, he revels in his debauchery, and everyone in the audience, certainly when I saw your production, there's that little glimmer, that little twinkle in the eye of like, yeah.
Well, but you never know whether we love him because he's doing it for us, and so we don't have to go to the same lengths. Kurt Lampe, you wanted to come in.
I just wonder whether Falstaff is a hedonist in the same sense as the Cyrenaics, or, well, in the same sense as, for example, I am a sort of hedonist, but I won't talk about myself right now. Because as I was rereading these wonderful plays for this, it occurred to me that what's striking about him is this compulsive intake of money and then consumption of sweet wine and rich meat, and then other sorts of consumption and pleasure as well. And I wonder whether this is almost more important than, because he seems to push it beyond the point where it's necessarily pleasant. Of course, he talks about gout and pox and so on, right? Yeah. And is there something in a character like Falstaff that's actually very different than in someone like Aristippus, or again, me? But let's talk about Aristippus, who actually is trying to rationalize and harmonize and beautify his life, and would definitely avoid pushing it to the point where it becomes painful.
I think you're right. I think Falstaff, in the way that Tony Sher plays him, what Tony has noticed is that Falstaff indeed is constantly trying to clean up his act. Right at the end of the part one, he says, if I grow great again, I'll grow less. Which is ridiculous for the size of the man that he is, that he's ever going to, grow less. And the way that Tony Sher plays him, he's constantly pouring away the bottle of sack or whatever it is, and trying to mend his ways. But of course, we don't want him to mend his ways. We need him to be a sort of a great pagan green man in our world, in a way.
But he's he is doing that rationalisation thing, because that line about teaching his sons to addict themselves to sack, it's a very technical word, addict, isn't it, in the Elizabethan age? It means to dedicate yourself in a kind of quite formal way, almost legal way. So it's not addiction as we know it, it's a consecration.
True, and he regards it as a principle,
yeah.
which is presumably a philosophic principle.
Julia Twigg, Shakespeare also has this constant running theme, a distrust of ascetics. I mean, that's the other thing that is running through Henry IV, isn't it? This feeling always that the ascetic is hostile to human pleasure, that they're punitive, essentially. I mean, you think of the Duke in Measure for Measure. He's regarded as not somebody who's principled, but somebody who's actually just cruel on a personal level to people. Don't you think? You're looking doubtful.
Particularly about the Duke. Not sure. I mean,
when he makes water, his urine is congealed ice. I mean,
yes.
he's seen as
that's
inhuman.
That's enemy propaganda, though.
It is enemy propaganda, but nobody comes to defend him, really.
Yeah,
the Duke
true.
makes a half-hearted attempt.
Yes, that's true.
I think it's very difficult for us to respond warmly to the word ascetic, frankly. So if we were to sort of say moderation or being sensible or control or other virtues, then possibly. But I think ascetic is something that has a kind of sort of buzz of a bee to it that makes it unattractive. And I certainly think asceticism in its sort of raw form is pretty unattractive. And that's not to say, however, that it isn't quite a persistent theme within modern culture, because I think it links to certain things about the rationalisation of our lives, the kind of controlled and lives and jobs that we now do, which mean that kind of discipline is more prominent.
I was a bit surprised to find that the root of asceticism is actually where it has no connection with denial. It has a connection with training. Is this right?
That's absolutely right, yes.
And training almost in an athletic context. You could use the word ascesis to mean athletic
yes, certainly.
training.
It just means training or exercise would be an adequate translation for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Zoe Cormier, I want to turn to you because you've applied the pleasure principle to science
Yes.
As a part of guerrilla science. You go round festivals and you teach people science, but in the most pleasurable way possible. And you've also written this book, Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll, which
Indeed.
is subtitled The Science of Hedonism, the hedonism of science. We were talking a little earlier about kind of baseness in animals. The received opinion is that our reason sets us apart from animals. And you make the point very early on in your book that our pleasures are highly distinctive too, that they also set us apart. What is distinctive about our capacity for enjoyment? Is it a general thing or is it a cluster of separate facts?
The more you look at our capacity to indulge in pleasure and to take pleasure from life, the more you realize that it's a really crucial part of what makes us who we are. So philosophers, scientists, every kind of higher thinker has thought about what is it that sets humans apart from other animals. And usually what they look to are quote-unquote higher cognitive capacities, such as the ability to do mathematics, the capacity to think about the past, present, and future, the capacity for self-consciousness. But our quote-unquote animalistic pursuits, music, sex, drugs, have been denigrated as base. But the more you look at them, the more you realize they're actually quite spectacular. And we would not be human if we wasn't for the fact that we indulge in all three of those things to a spectacular degree.
We clearly remain tied to our animal physiology, don't we? There's a very fascinating story you tell about losing a beauty contest to an orangutan. I mean, it's very good of you to tell it, and it's a very specific kind of beauty contest. Just explain what the experiment was, because it was rather interesting.
Sure. So we wanted to examine what happens when you go without bathing, and if that would influence what you smelled like, how attractive your smell was, and the impact it would have on other people. So we got a couple of chaps. One of my best mates, in fact, was one of them. He went 40 days without bathing. Even if it rained, he would hold newspapers over his head to prevent any water from touching his skin. And so we then had him and this other lad wear T-shirts at different stages throughout their fast from cleansing, as you might put it. And we then gave strips of T-shirts to our audience members at the Secret Garden Party and asked them to rate the strips of T-shirt for a few different factors. Number one, how attractive each strip was. Number two, if they thought it belonged to a boy or a girl. And number three,
You don't need to give the detail. I'm wanting to get to the orangutan.
Yeah. So we had 2 boys and 2 girls. So the girls were me and an orangutan. What was fascinating was we asked people
You didn't force.
No. We just wanted people to. What was fascinating was to see if people could tell if they were male or female, and by absolute majority vote, people could tell that the strips from the boys came from boys, and they could tell that the ones from me and the orangutan were from females. But more people thought the orangutan was female than me. And when we asked the audience to rate all 4 of us on a scale of attractiveness, the orangutan won. Was deemed more. And my best friend pointed at me and he said, "You will never live this down. An orangutan is sexier than you are."
I think it's a badge of pride. I don't think you should be ashamed of it. Sorry, Julia Twigg.
I was just going to say, it reminds me of that 19th century phrase, bouquet de corsage, which was a kind of sense of the sort of scent of the body that arose as it was hot within the ballroom from a woman's dress, as it were.
Yeah.
But obviously by the 20th century, that becomes a BO and something unacceptable.
Yeah.
But it is touching on just the kind of things you were talking about.
Yeah.
Zoe, the final third of your book deals in a way with the most refined of the pleasures, because it's music. So it's the least physical of the pleasures. I mean, or the one we experience as the least physical. Again, the common assumption would be that music is, I've just expressed it, is one of the more higher rarefied, but it goes very, very far back in the human record, doesn't it? I mean, there are very, very ancient evidence of an interest in music.
In fact, the oldest recovered artifact ever is a flute. It's a flute made from the bone, the femur of a bear, and that's 40,000 years old. So imagine how much longer.
It's a bit disputed, that flute bone. Isn't it? Some say it's a bitten bone.
Oh, that's nonsense. Just look at a photograph of it. The 2 holes in it are perfectly symmetrical in diameter.
I agree. It looks like a flute to me.
They've even done reconstructions of it, and it makes the do, re, mi, fa scale. So it's pronounced babje, and it's from Slovenia, and it's 40,000 years old. So imagine how much longer we were singing or clapping or just making any kind of cacophonous noise.
We know that music, that animals make noise, certainly. We know that they make, as it were, musical noises occasionally.
Yes.
But there's no evidence that they make music in any sense that we would understand it.
It really depends on how you define music. So it's an astoundingly difficult term to define. The more you think about it, the more difficult it becomes. And the more you learn about music, and the more you realize that it's basically a construct of the brain. Okay, so music does not exist in the world around you. Music exists inside your head and only inside your head. It is an imaginary thing. It's an illusion. That's what music is. And it's basically all the parts of your brain working together to create this incredible perception of harmony and symmetry and patterns that are completely illusory.
But it doesn't feel like a mental pleasure, does it? It feels like a physical pleasure. Is there any research into why it is that melody or that rhythm will put the hair on the back of your neck?
Yes, there is. So they've found that there's a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. And if you were to indulge in sexual pleasures or any kind of narcotic pleasure, it results in the release of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And music does the exact same thing. When you listen to a tune that you really love and you feel goosebumps raised on your skin, it's because you are actually having the release of dopamine and endorphins and serotonin, the happy chemical. It's an actual chemical exhilarating experience on a fundamentally physical level.
Now, we know the mechanics of that work, but are there any theories about why the mechanics of that work? Why have we evolved to have such a potent response to something which, as you say, is an illusion? Is crafted by our brains?
There's a few different ideas. What's the most obvious one? I can't talk about it too much as it's 9:30 on a Monday, but it would be sex and
so rhythm, as it were, or
well, I mean, Darwin certainly thought that music was sexually selected. That basically men evolved to create noises to attract females. We all know that musicians tend to be rather fortunate in that department.
You've only moved the problem one step down, though, haven't you? Because you've still got to explain why the females are attracted to the music. That's the theory I'm looking for. Greg Doran.
Shakespeare's other great hedonist, Falstaff's younger sister, as it were, Cleopatra, describes music as music, moody food of us that trade in love.
That's awesome.
It's a great description, isn't it?
That's brilliant.
Well, you also, Zoe, have
Yes.
a kind of transliteration of Orsino's thing about "Is it not strange that sheep's guts should hail souls out of men's bodies?" I mean, you write it up as, intestines and cat and horsehair, but it's the same thing, isn't it? That this vibration will do something most extraordinary to us. Kurt Lampe, I want to come to you because Plato particularly recognised this, didn't he? There was a very early recognition. He would have banned music from his Republic, along with sort of some contemporary
Plato would have banned anything fun
dogmatisms.
from the Republic.
Well, I think that's not exactly right. It would be fair to say that in the Platonic tradition, there's and previously in the Pythagorean tradition, there's a profound interest in music because they are aware of the fact that not only that it gives us pleasure, but that in giving us pleasure, it tends to educate us, to strengthen certain parts of the psyche, and to weaken others. And so that's what the debate is all about within the ancient philosophical tradition: is how should music be used to educate the soul.
So what was Plato's huge suspicion with it? He thought it was weakening the wrong part of
Certain
it.
kinds of music, precisely, would strengthen the wrong parts of the soul and weaken the wrong parts of the soul.
That has a huge and continuing tradition, doesn't it, Zoe Cormier? The continual kind of moral panics we get about certain kinds of rhythmic music and certain kinds of, particularly the pleasure that young people have in music.
Even right now in Mali, they're trying to ban music, and Mali has one of the richest musical traditions of any country on earth.
Is there any scientific account of why it is that young brains are so responsive to music? Because I think that is a broad, again, maybe it's a received opinion and isn't backed up by science, but generally I remember myself being possessed by music at the age of 18 in a way that I am not now. Is there anything about the human brain that changes?
Yes, there's quite a lot, actually. Like, if you have music lessons as a child, it strengthens a part of your brain called the corpus callosum, which is basically the networks that connect the left and the right sides of your brain. And the idea that there's a left side or a right side to your brain, there's a lot of debate around that. I mean, it's controversial. However, we do know that music is the only thing that will connect the two sides of your head.
What, and make the brain work in concert? With itself.
One could put it that way. They have also done a number of studies that found that children who have music lessons will improve their performance in mathematics, in language, in grammar, in athletics. You name it, it improves. And music is pretty much the only thing that does that. And I think, most of all, what science has revealed is that it is not a trivial pleasure. It is biologically relevant.
Julia Twigg, I'm going to turn to you. I mean, as with all spheres, music isn't exempt from the aesthetic notion, is it? There are kind of aesthetic notions that listening to a difficult piece of Bach is somehow more good for us than listening to Little Polka Dot Bikini, say.
Yes, that's a hierarchy of importance, as it were, or significance. But there's also this question that some sorts of music seem to be more intellectual, more cerebral. And you cite Bach as opposed to a rock music with a really heavy kind of rhythm, as it were. I suppose I have difficulty in this area because I don't really want to divide us up into body and mind in quite the way we seem to be doing around the table. So it doesn't seem to me at all surprising that intellectual excitement, pattern making, which is, I assume, fundamentally what music is, some complex form of pattern, should be both a sort of intellectual excitement but also be experienced in that bodily, physical way. I mean, I think most of us, when we listen to music, experience it in our bodies. Even Bach, it's not an entirely sort of cerebral thing. So I suppose I'd want to kind of link those two into a kind of lived sense of embodiment.
You're here to talk about asceticism, and mostly about the fact that, I mean, we conventionally might assume that asceticism doesn't play much part in modern secular life, that essentially it's a religious tradition or a philosophical tradition which has fallen into abeyance. You argue that it's just gone underground a bit. So what are the sort of things that you're looking at in contemporary life that you see as a continuation of that?
Yes, I think there are interesting parallels with practices in the past, as you say, located often in a religious tradition, and that their continuation into a modern secular world. So it's not just that they continue, but they're actually quite central to the project of modernity. And I suppose the kind of things I'm thinking about, for example, the culture of fasting, entirely secularised. You know, we've taken that religious tradition of fast and we've now given it a whole world. After Christmas, magazines will be full of detoxing and dreadful regimes that we've got to spend January in, you know, the worst time of the year to be possibly thinking about such things. So that's a kind of imposition of control.
It's an interesting switch, that, though, isn't it? Because the religious tradition was to do the fasting first and then reward yourself.
Absolutely. Advent was a preparation and nothing happened until Christmas Eve, and then, wow, you know, Christmas broke out and you had 12 days of rejoicing. And that seems to me a much better way than our sort of beginning to rejoice, or at least start eating in November, as it were. So by the time it's kind of 12th night, people are fed up with those decorations and fed up with those carols. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for the old system.
One of the reasons for the old system, presumably, was because there was no danger of it continuing. I mean, you probably, it was wise to have a famine in November because you were beginning to run out of things and you were going to harvest and store things for the Christmas festival. And then you were going to go into the hungry months anyway afterwards. So there was no danger of it, as there is for us, of it just endlessly rolling on.
Yes, I think that's true. And I mean, one of our problems for most people in the West anyway is one of just abundance and dealing with the whole problem of abundance and the whole question of food and the management of food and anxieties that have grown around food and diets and the new demands that we all be slim, that we control ourselves, is that it takes place within a context for most people of abundance.
Was that an issue that arose for the Greeks? Because, I mean, as it were, Aristippus clearly has the means to spend his time buying expensive fish, as we know, as his enemies pointed out, and also thinking about things. So he was within a context of abundance, and that it became a specific problem then.
Yeah, well, first I would say the Cyrenaics do insist that actually the virtuous person is the person who is capable of discovering pleasure in any circumstance. So if you're excellent enough, it doesn't matter whether you have caviar and fine women, or because almost all the Cyrenaics are men, or not. You know, you can. I won't. Again, it's because of the time of day. I can't exemplify it. But there's other ways to enjoy yourself.
Yeah. Julia, just coming back to you, one of the things that I thought was very interesting in the piece you wrote was this connection between modernism and asceticism. That's a sort of aesthetic move towards less is more, essentially.
Yes, I think you can see it most vividly in that post-First World War world, where you can see it across a whole range of things. Architecturally, as you say, less is more. The whole sort of sense that architecture at that time is described in terms of clean, fresh, open, sunlight. There's a whole set of sunlight movements in which children are encouraged to run out into the sun and take their clothes, or take off the heavy Victorian drapes, as it were. And a lot of that's about anti-Victorianism, actually.
It's rather interesting, though, isn't it? Because that's an entirely different reaction to abundance. You emerge from a Victorian period in which, as it were, material goods are abundant, and you cram your house with them.
Yes. And
then you reach this point of disgust and...
Yes, and you cleanse yourself, as it were, by having, you know, just blinds or only kind of bleached linen curtains at most, sort of thing. Yes, it is a response to that material abundance that was produced by the industrial world.
Greg Doran, Shakespeare's not keen on asceticism, is he? I mean, there are almost no ascetics. I can't think of one.
It's interesting. I mean, I suppose he's interested in the spectrum, isn't he? He's interested, in a way, Falstaff at one end and Henry IV at the other. There's a fantastic line that Henry IV says in terrible anxiety about the straits that his son Prince Hal is getting into, and he says that Prince Hal will become Henry V, and he will pluck the muzzle of restraint from the wild dog, and the wild dog will then flesh his tooth in every innocent, as if somehow, without what the Elizabethans called continence, without a sense of that moderation, as you were saying, Julia, without that, then society will collapse in some way. But Shakespeare knows that it's a balance and that you have to have both sides. You can't have just Falstaff. It's too rich a pudding.
That's right back to our kind of body, mind, and you know, the animal within us, isn't it? Muzzling the dog too. Kurt Lampe, you want to?
Yeah, I thought this might be the moment to bring in that there might be an important, really centrally human pleasure in restraint and indeed in self-punishment. So then when we have these, especially religious rites of fasting followed by feasting, or in general guilt and atonement followed by celebration, or the other way around, especially when they're embedded in a meaningful religious tradition where you think it's about, for example, your sinfulness and your redemption, and there's even more vivid examples in the ancient world. I mean, maybe that is precisely what modern shallow, naive hedonism is lacking.
It is. It's a question, isn't it? Because modern asceticism isn't obedient to any external authority, except perhaps fashion, which we think of as a rather disreputable authority.
Well, I think it arises out of a whole set of demands, and you could see it as part of the wider bodily perfectionism that we've seen within the sort of modern period. A new requirement that people control their bodies, present themselves. It's partly to do with visual culture, so the whole business of the slim ideal that comes in the 20th century and spreads and becomes a requirement. Of course, it's a slim ideal that we now increasingly in society we don't meet up to, because, as we know, we have rising levels of obesity, as it were. So it's a funny tension, this growing slim dominant requirement, and yet the reality of people's failure. So there's a lot of failure in there as well.
And has its kind of toxic byroads as well. I mean,
absolutely toxic. If you think of things like eating disorders, which are particularly malignant playing out of these themes.
But it is that is at root what asceticism is, isn't it? It's control of appetite, that idea of self-control. The idea that we're not... I mean, there is a sort of fear, a core of fear at the very heart of it. Being out of
control. Yes, yeah. I think that's right. I think it's probably the case that all societies have elements of control. You couldn't simply have social order without control and intersubjective rules of behaviour. So I think to that degree, we never get rid of those aspects of control. I think it's a fantasy to have this notion that we can be free, as if being free is some sort of state that's natural to us. I don't think that's the case.
What would Aristippus have been recommending for Christmas?
I really don't know. Oh, well.
A huge lavish fish, presumably.
Yeah, fish, wine, expensive wine, and courtesans.
And a courtesan. He was very bad with his courtesans, wasn't he? I mean, we probably shouldn't go there because he treated them absolutely terribly.
We don't know how badly Aristippus himself treated courtesans, but within the Cyrenaic tradition, well, this is, as I said, this is the beginning of that tendency to go towards the devaluation of personal relationships, and it's certainly one of the, I think, uglier aspects of Cyrenaicism.
Okay, well, we can sanction wine, we can sanction fish or turkey, but not courtesans. We've run out of time. Thank you to all my guests. Greg Doran is Artistic Director of the RSC, and his production of Henry IV, Part 1 and 2 is at the Barbican now. Zoe Cormier's Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll and Kurt Lampe's The Birth of Hedonism are out now. And thanks also to Julia Twigg, Professor of Social Policy and Sociology at the University of Kent. Next week, Andrew Marr on the importance of place. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
All sorts of different lifestyles. For example, you can believe that and perhaps be a mathematician, you could be a progressive politician, you could be a barista at a cafe, or many other things. That's not really true of ancient hedonisms like Cyrenaicism or Epicureanism.
So what's the further step they take?
Yes. You don't really get to the essence, I think, of these philosophies, and you lose a lot of what's important about them if you think that the core of them is a belief that pleasure is important or is motivational. Rather, I think it's useful to think of them as entire ways of life. That's why the subtitle to my book involves the phrase "way of life." So hedonism in the ancient, for Cyrenaicism, for example, would be, of course, it would involve those beliefs, but then it would also be a network of ways of thinking and speaking, a network of emotions and aspirations, a network of behaviors and deliberate exercises, perhaps even a network of imagination, patterns of all these things, which are knitted together by the fact that pleasure is sort of a guiding star in all the different domains.
Your central figure is Aristippus. I mean, he is...
Go about it. Well, fish. It's important to say that in ancient Greek antiquity, fish is the premier luxury food. So this would be like a defense of eating caviar today, for example. And how would he go about it? Well, we would just imagine that the book will defend basically the goodness of pleasure. There's anecdotes, for example, where he's blamed for spending a lot of money on fish, or some other luxury food, and he says, well, would you spend this amount of money? You spent $1,000 on caviar yesterday. Well, he says, would you have spent $10 if you had on caviar? In any event, the anecdote will end up with the point, well, the problem is not that I spend too much on, that I think too much of pleasure. The problem is that you think too much of money, right? So this is what's valuable, so of course I spend money on it.
This derives from actually quite a kind of serious philosophy of perception, doesn't it? Because they begin from the point that all we can know is our own responses to the world. And so any other value might be illusory, or it's a great mover for this. The school kind of seems to form around him. One of the interesting things, reading your book, is that our knowledge of his philosophy seems to be largely preserved in disapproving accounts of it. That we mostly get it through people who thought he was wrong.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. In the ancient tradition, hedonism was always a minority and always the odd man out. So there was lots and lots of philosophical schools in the ancient world, most of which non-specialists forget about these days, and we don't have much evidence about them. But in later antiquity, you get this tendency to unify all of them, to say, oh, well, they're all kind of saying the same thing. You get this again in the Renaissance, the attempt to...
But the disapproval is very largely about lifestyle, isn't it? There's wonderful title for one of Aristapus's works, Towards Those Who Blame Him for Being Extravagant in His Expenditure on Fish. So he comes along and he says, all right, I'm going to philosophically defend spending a lot of money on fish. How does he go about it?
Well, that work is probably spurious and doesn't survive. How would he...
Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. It's a time of year when even the most self-denying among us relax a little and give way to appetite and self-indulgence. Perhaps, though, we should be living like that all year round, letting the pursuit of pleasure guide our lives. The original hedonists would have thought so, and hedonism is what we're talking about this morning, with the classicist Kurt Lampe, whose book The Birth of Hedonism details the intellectual origins of the idea that a lot of what you fancy does you good. Also with us, the science writer Zoe Cormier, whose book Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll investigates the science of human pleasure, and Greg Doran, artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, who's just brought that great hero of self-indulgence, Falstaff, to the London stage in his production of Shakespeare's Henry IV plays. And, for reasons of balance, a little bit of ascetic self-denial too, which the sociologist Julia Twigg argues is far more widespread in the modern world than we might think. But we're going to start with Kurt Lampe. Kurt, you've written a book called The Birth of Hedonism about the Cyrenaic school of philosophy, roughly around the turn of the 3rd century. Most listeners, I think, would know what hedonism means now, which is just a kind of sensual self-indulgence. Some, I guess, would then also associate it with philosophy, but they might come up with the name Epicurus. You're going further back. You're going back to the origins. What did hedonism mean back in 390 BC?
Okay, well, I think that's a great question to start with, because one of the, at least if you're thinking about it philosophically, one of the important points to begin with when you're talking about hedonism is to say the word means lots of different things, and in fact it's a modern word. If you look at the most important modern philosophical, most prestigious introductions to hedonism, you'll find statements like hedonism is the belief that all and only pleasure motivates human beings, or hedonism is the belief that all and only pleasure has intrinsic value or importance for human beings. And that is compatible with the